So much happening regarding China and the Australia-Chinese relationship. Let's cross to Beijing now and catch up with Tom Cheshire, who's the Sky News correspondent there. Thanks for joining us, Tom. Huge amount of friction between Beijing and Canberra at the moment. The World Health Organization now looking to oversee this international investigation into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. What's the message been out of Beijing? Because it's been mixed around the world. There's been a lot of opposition to it from some ambassadors, but Xi Jinping is saying that China is a willing participant now.
Yeah, it's been changing and shifting this message all the way through. I mean, what we know is that the WHO itself has been calling for China to help it investigate the origins of the virus. We've spoken to the China representative for the WHO here, and he said he'd been asking to go to Wuhan, especially since it opened up a couple of months ago, but so far hadn't heard anything from the Chinese side. And what China's been saying is now is not the time. But they've started shifting that a little bit as a result of Australia calling for an investigation into the origins, which made Beijing pretty furious, and we've seen some of the effects of that in terms of it being linked to these barley tariffs and perhaps potential measures in the future. Now, despite that, Australia's managed to lead a pretty effective coalition around the world, but China has come round to it because it says the WHO investigation isn't the same thing as what Australia has been asking for. And if you look at the WHO language, and had lots of signatories to it, you know, all of the EU countries around the world, but also crucially countries like Russia, which is a friend of China's, backing it. I think that's a sign that China was happy with it and China accepting it, because it's supposed to be an investigation into the global response to this pandemic. It does include the zoonotic origins of it, but China says this is a different thing from what Australia was asking for.
That's the nature of diplomacy, isn't it? You draft a resolution that everybody can claim some victory on. I just want to pick up, Tom, on something you just said there. Are you saying, clarifying, that the World Health Organization China representative has not been allowed into Wuhan yet?
No, so I'll just clarify that a bit. He himself actually has been to Wuhan. He went there in the early days, but what they want to do now is send a team to Wuhan again. They had sort of a whistle-stop tour back in January before the international team came in February. What they want to do is have access to what China's been investigating over this time, have access to the samples. They've been asking to take part in that investigation, and so far that hadn't happened. That started to maybe shift, but as far as I'm aware now, they haven't yet had access to China's own internal investigation into the origins of COVID-19, despite the fact all along this, China's been saying when the US has attacked China and said, you know, perhaps this came from a lab, that language actually the US seems to have gone away from. China's always said this should not be a political matter, it should be a matter from the scientists. At the same time, it wasn't necessarily letting the scientists in as part of its investigations.
Just briefly, Tom, we understandably see all this through the prism of Australia, but when you're looking at this globally, has Australia led the charge on the push for this investigation, and is Beijing particularly focused in pushing back against Australia?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary, actually, completely. Australia was the first to sort of stick out its neck on that front. And a lot of people, you know, both in Australia and around the world, thinking that's a pretty brave move. But countries around the world, and especially in Africa as well, where China has a big influence, they do want answers and they want some sort of accountability, some sort of investigation. But I think the terms of how this has been drawn, when Xi Jinping was giving his address to the World Health Assembly, he was there front and centre promising $2 billion in aid, promising to make a vaccine if it comes from China a global good. And then when this investigation says, he says he welcomes it, but only once the pandemic is under control. Who knows when that will be? Who knows how China will define it? It's a pretty good way of, if not delaying it, at least finding a way to control it and make sure they're happy with how the investigation proceeds, that it happens on their terms.
Great stuff, Tom. Thanks for all that clarity.
No worries.